I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Our next speaker is Executive Director of the Central City East Association, where she manages 3 business districts, business improvement districts in downtown Los Angeles, the Downtown Industrial District, the Toy District, and the Arts District. With a combined budget of $3 million, she has an extensive background in the media, where she brings her great communication skills to this very important project today. Our next speaker is Estela Lopez.
Thank you, Brian. Never did I think I'd come to the podium after a mention of internet porn, but nevertheless, here I am. My goodness, to be standing here with, first of all, a hero of mine on the day of Dr. Kelling. And Gretchen, I forgot to mention yesterday when I took you on the tour, the articles that I had that were written by you and about you. This is a woman who was doing walking, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. When here in Los Angeles, I was struggling to try to explain to our policymakers what business improvement districts were all about and how they were transforming the large cities on the East Coast. Gretchen in Times Square, Dan Biederman at the Grand Central Partnership, Paul Levy in Philadelphia were my role model, and it's a great honor to be here today in your presence. Thank you to the Institute for the opportunity to address you this morning and to provide you with the unique perspective of the community that strives to provide economic investment and job stability to the Central City East area of downtown Los Angeles. Again, the discussion that we're having this morning is certainly not a philosophical one for those of us that spend our days and nights in the Skid Row area. This is not a discussion that's taking place in a vacuum. It is taking place, as you heard earlier, on the streets where people live, and not just the unsheltered, but the sheltered, the people in the SROs, the people in the missions. But it's also a place where people work. It is a place where many of the people who live in South and East Los Angeles come to work every day, who count on the jobs that are the gateway to the middle class for many of our low and unskilled population. These people, their opportunity to work, to provide a home, to provide for their families, their rights are the ones that we also have to keep in mind and protect. The Central City East Association is in its 23rd year of providing representation to a significant part of the downtown business community. CCEA represents and provides services to 110 blocks of downtown Los Angeles, from Los Angeles Street east to the Los Angeles River. As you heard, we manage 3 business improvement districts, providing private security, sidewalk maintenance, and marketing assistance to our stakeholders. We represent the employers of 15,000 workers, primarily in the manufacturing and food processing industries. First of all, I want to say that our organization thanks Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, Police Chief Bill Bratton, City Attorney Rocky Delgadillo, and the numerous police and prosecutors assigned to the Safer Cities Initiative. In approximately a year and a half, they've accomplished nothing short of remarkable. The embedded culture of lawlessness, while it's not been entirely defeated, has most assuredly met its match. Skid Row is where 2 very different constituencies meet. It's where people come looking for a bed, a meal, a helping hand when they have nothing and nowhere left to go. This is where they are supposed to receive employment training, substance abuse, counseling and treatment, medical and mental health care. But as I said at the beginning, this is also a place where people go to work. They run businesses and contribute to the economy of the region. This 50-block area represents nearly $12 million annually in combined utility, sales, business, and property taxes. Something that isn't as well known is that it's also home to a couple of very special institutions. Inner city arts, where children receive classes in the visual and performing arts, and Para los Niños, where the parents, the working parents, the people I just described to you, bring their children for child care and Head Start programs. And their safety and their well-being is a primary concern to us as well. Let me set a little bit of history for you. In the late 1800s, Skid Row was a drop-off point for the railways bringing job seekers to the industrial and agricultural jobs here in Los Angeles. These job seekers were mostly single men. The saloons and the brothels soon followed. So did the missions, catering to those whose dreams of a better job and a better life fell through. The Depression brought more workers than jobs. The unemployed became the unemployable. Decades passed, and alcohol addiction took its toll. Fast forward to 1975. That's when the city devised its policy of containment for Skid Row. The objectives were to stabilize the low-income housing stock that was already here, and to attract and consolidate social services in one area. The introduction of crack cocaine in the 1980s brought a new and deadly chapter to Skid Row, one that we are still living with today. The population became younger, severely addicted, more violent, and in need of more intensive assistance. 2 decades later, the view was unimaginable. You saw some of these images earlier in Commander Smith's presentation, but for you to understand what for the last 30 years Skid Row has looked like, you need to look at these pictures. Entire sidewalks covered from gutters to doorways, with people injecting themselves with drugs day and night. Bodies in full overdose seizures. Acts of prostitution in full view of passing vehicles and pedestrians. Violent transient on transient attacks. Communicable diseases from people eating, vomiting, defecating, and urinating in the same place. And again, I want to underscore that the businesses in this area are primarily food-related businesses. We have had companies who had to lay off employees because of canceled contracts, companies that do not want food produced, processed in this area. In 2005, the year that preceded the implementation of the Safer Cities Initiative, our BID security officers responded to 77,000 calls for service. 77,000 calls for service in a 50-block area. Some of these calls were for criminal activity reported by our members or observed by our safety patrols. But others were instances where our BID security assisted people who were disoriented, overdosed, physically or mentally impaired. Our sidewalks were filled with people not living on them, but dying on them. As a result, of the Safer Cities Initiative, the numbers, but more importantly, the lives that those numbers represent are beginning to change. Now again, in 2005, 77,000 calls for service. In 2006, with SCI in place only 6 months, that number dropped by more than 10,000 to 65,000. In 2007, in numbers that we just tabulated, our bid security responses are down to 39,000. These numbers are still unacceptable, and they still represent a human tragedy that plays out on our sidewalks every day. But thanks to SCI, we are on the right track. The business community understands that police and prosecutors are not the total answer. We need a regional commitment to, one, ending the centralization of indigent services in one community, and two, funding adequate services for all those who need them. But Chief Bill Bratton, the LAPD, and everyone who contributed to the Safer Cities Initiative did what no one had done. They took that very important first step. Thanks to all of them.
Thank you very much. The official bio of our next speaker says she has been an activist for social justice for 40 years. This must have been some unusual pre-K type of activity on your part. Seemed obvious. She is one of Mayor Villaraigosa's senior advisors on nonprofit issues and on community issues, and she is his point person on the very important issue of homelessness and social justice, and believes very much, I think, in trying to understand where poverty comes from. We're very glad she could join us today. Torie Osborn.
Well, I'm very glad to be here. I admit one of the attractions was that I went to elementary school with Gretchen Dykstra, and I haven't seen her since 1962. So it's really a pleasure to see you again. I've followed your career and your visionary leadership from the business perspective and the government perspective in remaking Times Square in particular, but you have a long career of the kind of transformation that I think at long last is beginning to come to Los Angeles under the leadership at the city level of my boss, Mayor Villaraigosa, and I'm really glad to be here. I think some of you probably know that there are a number of, I'm occupying supposedly a skeptic position on the panel, but I think probably some of you know that some of the folks who are the most skeptical about Safer City are boycotting this. Now, I don't believe in boycotting any forum where we are talking about such vitally important issues, so I was really glad to be invited, even though I'm not Gary Blasey, who I think was the first choice. And for those of you who don't know, Gary Blasey is a professor at UCLA Law School who, with 3 other professors and 13 law students, spent 4,000 hours analyzing the data on Safer Cities in its first year and issued a report which you can get on the UCLA Law School website, and is well worth reading as a kind of a counterpoint to some of what we're hearing today. It's a perspective missing. I can't represent it myself. I have some other things I want to say, but it's definitely worth looking at, and I think. So I was asked to talk on the lessons from Skid Row, and I I would say three things really quickly, and then I hope that we have a good discussion here. I just want to say, I believe kind of one of the role of leadership is to just, tell it like it is. The containment theory on Skid Row is a failure. It was a 30-year policy. It came out of good intentions in the 1970s because most cities were raising their poor Skid Row and Bowery areas to the ground. The city of Los Angeles made a decision instead to take care of people. It was at the time a progressive decision to try to take care of people, to develop housing for poor people, to subsidize, tax dollars subsidize permissions to move in or closer to Skid Row so there would be some drug and alcohol treatment. Now I want to tell you, in 1975, when Skid Row, when the containment policy was adopted, there were all of about 1,200 homeless people in Los Angeles City. This was before the crack epidemic has been mentioned, but this was before the affordable housing crisis that began in the 1980s under Reagan, who cut 80% of affordable housing dollars in his first year in office, and then a range of additional economic and housing-related policies that have increased poverty, decreased the middle class, and increased barriers to getting out of poverty. And let us not forget, homelessness is an extreme result of poverty. I was really glad to see recently there's a Gallup poll the Fannie Mae Foundation commissioned that shows that attitudes towards homelessness have radically changed in the last 5 years in this country, and this is a good thing for all of us who are solution-oriented. It used to be that people thought that homeless people were there because it was their own, because they chose to be. They wanted to be homeless, they chose to stay homeless. Today, most people understand it's because of a lack of housing or treatment services, of housing or loss of a job, basically structural. Housing economics are the cause, and usually a personal vulnerability makes it tougher to get off the street, whether it's a medical condition or substance abuse or mental illness. The knowledge about this population has increased dramatically, and I'm glad that public understanding, education has changed as well in the last few years. I will give George Bush a lot of credit on this one, the Interagency Council on Homelessness, Philip Mondano, who has traveled across the country to 320 cities and preached the gospel of housing, not shelter, of ending homelessness, not managing homelessness, of a paradigm shift from emergency services and short-term response to long-term medical and interventions has been critical. And I think that's partly, people are getting it, there are solutions to this problem. So the containment theory was a failure for all kinds of reasons. It doesn't match contemporary, it was old anti-poverty theory with concentration of services or housing, those old horrible public housing projects. State-of-the-art on poverty alleviation, savings for homelessness, is deconcentration, is citywide strategies, countywide strategies, scattered site strategies, and mixed use commercial on the ground floor, permanent supportive housing, structures that are mixed income, permanent supportive housing within the context of a mixed income community. We're talking really about a different vision, and it's a vision that my boss, Mayor Villaraigosa, champions, believes in, and believes that we are at the beginning of an altered conversation in Los Angeles, beginning at ground zero of the issue, which is Skid Row. So containment theories of failure, I think in the context of just the human tragedy. I mean, these pictures break my heart. I don't know what they do to you, but they break my heart. And in the context of beginning, under Mayor Villaraigosa's leadership, beginning to look where Los Angeles has not wanted to look for 30 years. Because the containment policy is about everybody not taking responsibility for building, at that time, shelter and housing where homeless people come from, which is all over the county. And so what has happened with Steve Lopez's column, with the mayor's election, with the recent focus on Skid Row, has been this kind of breaking through of denial and beginning to really look at the issue. And it was horrific what Skid Row became. When you don't have police and you don't have street services and you don't have trees trimmed and you don't have enough shelter, 83% of Los Angeles homeless are not sheltered, let alone housed. You can call it a culture of lawlessness. It's also a culture of despair. It's a culture of sick people. It's a culture of people who need help. And it becomes a ghettoized version of it that replicates itself. Okay, so here we are, fast forward. The mayor and I think most people believe that public safety is part of the solution. Yes, there are some advocates that are sort of anti-police. They're going to stay in that corner of their thinking forever, but that's not where most people are. That's not where most of the service providers are. That's not where most of the residents there are. That's certainly not where people in government are. The public safety is part of it. The more significant solution, if we want to be solution-oriented and we want to be cost-effective, it's not, Carol's presentation was the heart of the matter in terms of the solution, about supportive housing, about not cycling people in and out of jails onto the streets. I forget who mentioned Project 50. It may have been Gretchen, Dykstra. It's a transformative, small-scale project that the county is in the position of finalizing with support from the city and the LAPD in particular were wonderful. And what it does is uses a sort of state-of-the-art way to determine who the people who need help the most are, who are the people most likely to die on the streets within 7 years. And 50% of people on Skid Row are at risk of dying on the streets in 7 years. So they do a whole complex process I won't go through to determine who the 50 most vulnerable people were on the streets of Skid Row. And of those 50 people, and by the way, it is a myth that people are resistant to housing and services. It's a big old lie. I'm sick of it being perpetuated. It's a myth. There is ample data from research in the last decade that shows that well over 80% of people want to be housed and want to get help. They just haven't been able to get it. So I want to put that to rest. But at any rate, so the vulnerability index indicated among other things that of the 50 most vulnerable people, and it was social scientific methodology, 9 days out on the streets, 3 to 5 in the morning, etc. 90% of them have been in jail in the last 6 months, and 42% of them have been deceased. My issue with Safer City is not the wonderful work of the LAPD, or for that matter, the extraordinary collaboration of the city departments on the street services, the dedication of Commander Smith and Wakefield and Captain Wakefield and their team, who are terrific, and the street cops out there. It's really the cost effectiveness, or as Gretchen put it, the sustainability of this as a model for dealing with the population. Does it make sense for people who are 80% drug addicted and mentally ill? The co-occurring disorder is very high on Skid Row, highest